Picture the grandest dinner table you've ever seen in a painting. The long kind. The kind that takes up an entire room. White linen so starched it crinkles when you touch it. Silver candlesticks taller than a child. Roast pheasant on a platter with its tail feathers still attached, because why not? The host can afford it. He can afford the feathers. He can afford the whole bird and a dozen more besides. Crystal glasses catching candlelight and throwing it back across the ceiling. A butler standing at attention near the door, pretending he doesn't exist while absorbing every private conversation in the room. Now take that table, fold it in half, burn it for warmth. Now you have a better sense of how most people in Victorian England ate. We talk about the Victorian era and we immediately go to the wrong places. The Empire, the railways, the Crystal Palace, and its iron ribs and its 10 million visitors who came to see the future assembled under one roof. We think of gaslight and carriages and women in enormous dresses, and men with extraordinary facial hair making important decisions. We think of Dickens, because of course we think of Dickens. The man basically invented the Victorian era as a concept, at least the version of it that stuck. But here is the thing about Dickens. Even Dickens sanitized it. A little. Even the man who gave us Oliver Twist asking for more couldn't quite bring himself to describe what that gruel actually smelled like. What it tasted like when you'd been eating it every single day for 3 months, and your body had started to understand that this was all it was ever going to get. That's what we're doing tonight. Not the dinner party. Not the pheasant. We're going to the other table. The one that wasn't a table at all most days. The upturned crate, or the 2 boards balanced across sawhorses, or just the floor, just your hands, just eat it now before someone takes it. We're going to talk about what the poor in Victorian England actually ate. Not in a list, not as a history lesson. We're going to live it. One day. One kitchen. Everything that went into it, everything that came out of it, and everything that didn't come out of it at all, because there wasn't enough. I make these sleep stories, and honestly, I have no idea if anyone actually falls asleep to them, or if you're all just lying there wide awake, quietly disturbed by my descriptions of Victorian food that was technically made from things that had already been eaten once by something else. Either way, get comfortable. There's a cold draft coming under the door tonight. You'll understand why that matters in a moment. Here we go. Your eyes open, and you don't know what time it is because there is no clock. There has never been a clock in this room. A clock would cost 3 weeks of wages and would be pawned inside a month anyway. The next time the rent came due and the money wasn't there. You tell time by the church bells and by the light, and right now neither of them is saying anything useful because the church bells are silent and there is no light. None. The small window in the far wall is a grey rectangle that might be telling you it's 4 in the morning, or it might be telling you it's 2. The sky outside doesn't care enough to specify. What you know is this. It's cold. Not cold the way it gets cold in a nice house, where you notice the temperature has dropped and you put on another layer. Cold the way it gets cold when there is 1 blanket between 3 people and the fire in the grate downstairs burned out sometime round midnight, and the walls of this building are 2 inches of London brick that does not hold heat so much as grudgingly permit it to pass through on its way somewhere else. The cold has a texture in this room. It sits on your face like a damp cloth. It finds the gap between your shawl and your neck, and it stays there. It gets into your lungs when you breathe in too quickly, and you feel it. Actually feel it. Something solid and sharp sitting just behind your sternum. You breathe through your nose instead, slowly. The smell hits you a moment later. the way it always does when you've been asleep. Your nose stopped registering it an hour ago, but it comes back with consciousness, the way bad things always do. The room smells of damp plaster, the kind of damp that has been there so long it has grown its own small ecosystem in the corner behind the door. Mould, not aggressive, not the kind that kills you quickly, but the slow, patient kind that has been living in these walls since before your family moved in 3 years ago. Beneath that, coal dust. Always coal dust in London. It settles into everything, into the creases of your hands and the lines around your eyes and the lining of your lungs over the years. Beneath that, something animal. The smell of bodies that have been sleeping too close together. Your mother on the far side of the mattress. Your brother Tommy between you both. His feet near your hip. His breath coming in the small snuffling rhythm of a child who is getting too thin. And beneath all of it, the smell that is always underneath everything in this part of London. Food. Old food. The memory of food. It comes up through the floorboards from the room below, where Mrs. Hennessy keeps her stove going from 5 in the morning until 8 at night. Mrs. Hennessy runs what she calls a cook shop, and what the rest of the street calls something less polite, though they all buy from her. Fat rendered down, onions long past their prime, bones boiled for the 4th time, water that used to be something else. It has soaked into the wood of this building over years. That smell worked itself into the grain of the floorboards the way tree rings record drought years. You can read the history of hunger in these floors if you know how to look. Your name is Agnes Marsh. You are 17 years old. You've been in London for 14 months. Arrived from a village in Shropshire with your mother and your brother after your father died of a chest complaint that the local doctor gave 3 different names before deciding it didn't matter anymore since the man was dead either way. You arrived with 11 shillings and a letter from your father's cousin, who was supposed to help you, and who helped you, to be specific, by taking the 11 shillings and moving to Southwark without leaving an address. You've been making do since. Making do is, as it turns out, a full-time occupation. You work downstairs for Mrs. Hennessy. You've been working for her for 13 months. You work from 5 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, 6 days a week. You're paid 1 shilling and 4pence a week. From this you pay 2 shillings a month for the room upstairs, which leaves approximately nothing, which is why making do is a full-time occupation. But that comes later. Right now it's before 5, maybe 4:15. The church bells will ring at 4:30 and again at 5, and between now and then you have exactly the amount of time it takes to do everything that needs doing before you go downstairs. You sit up slowly, trying not to disturb Tommy. He's 12 now, thin in the way London boys get thin. Not the sturdy thinness of a country boy who runs and climbs, but the papery thinness of someone who doesn't get quite enough to eat, and who has spent the last winter breathing bad air inside buildings that were built for half the number of people currently living in them. He has dark circles under his eyes that he didn't have in Shropshire. He has a cough that comes and goes. The cough worries you more than almost anything else. Your feet find the floor. The boards are cold through your stockings, the kind of cold that immediately climbs up through the soles of your feet and settles in your ankles. You stand. The room tilts slightly the way rooms do in the first seconds after you stand up too fast, the way they do when you haven't eaten enough the night before, which is most nights. You wait for it to pass. It does. It takes you 4 minutes to dress in the dark. You do not need light. You have worn these same clothes every day for 8 months. Your hands know where everything is. The rough wool skirt that has a patch on the left side you sewed yourself, and that is only slightly less rough than the original fabric. The blouse with the collar that doesn't sit quite right, because you took it in when it was too big and now it's too tight in one direction and still too big in another. The apron, which is technically Mrs. Hennessy's, but which lives in this room because everything in your life lives in this room. The boots. The boots are the worst part of getting dressed in winter. They are leather, or were leather once. Before whatever life they lived before they came to you, wore them down to something between leather and paper. The left one has a crack along the outside of the sole that lets water in when it rains. The right one laces wrong. The top 3 holes stripped, so you wind the lace around the ankle instead and tie it there. And by mid-morning there is always a ridge of red skin where the lace has been pressing. You put them on, you lace them, you stand up, you're ready. You are 17 years old, and getting ready for the day takes 4 minutes because you own very few things, and this is most of what you own, and all of it is on your body now, and it's time. The stairs creak on the 3rd step, the 7th, and the 9th. You know this, and you step around the 3rd, angle your foot to the edge of the 7th, and plant your weight fast on the 9th so it gives its sound quickly and quietly, rather than the long complaining groan you get if you step in the middle. You've done this so many times your feet do it without instruction. The door at the bottom of the stairs is not locked. Mrs. Hennessy does not lock it. Anyone who wants to steal something from Mrs. Hennessy's cook shop is welcome to try, she has said more than once. And she means it, because what is there to steal? The money is in her apron pocket. The food is, well, you will see. You push the door open. The heat hits you before the smell. Or rather, they hit you at the same time, but your skin receives the heat first and your nose receives the smell a half-second later, the way lightning precedes thunder, the way cause precedes consequence. The smell is fat. Rendered animal fat in the large black pot on the left side of the stove, the one Mrs. Hennessy started yesterday morning and has been adding to since. It does not smell of any one animal. It is a general animal smell, complex and deep, the way a chord is deeper than a single note. There are notes of pork in it, from the trimmings she gets from the butcher on Whitechurch Lane who gives her the bits that don't sell. There are notes of beef from the sweet she renders down at the start of every week. There is something else underneath those, something that hasn't come from any named animal in any recent memory, something old and fundamental, the smell of fat that has been heated and heated and cooled so many times, it has become something else entirely, something that isn't quite food anymore, but isn't quite not food either. Beneath the fat, onions, always onions, the onions that have been sitting in the wire basket by the door, the ones that have started to go soft on the outside that need using soon, or they'll need using for something the street dogs might eat instead. In this kitchen, onions are never wasted. They are peeled to their last usable layer, the skins dried and kept for the stock pot. The outermost layers, the ones gone to slime, composted, everything else sliced and sweating and whatever fat is available, slow and brown and patient, giving everything they have. Beneath the onions, something sharp and ferrous. Blood. Not fresh blood. Nothing alarming, but the particular iron smell of blood that has been cooked out of meat. Old blood. The memory of blood. The ghost that stays in the pot long after everything else is done. And beneath all of that, the thing that is always beneath everything in this kitchen, the water. London water in 1882 has its own smell. You didn't notice it when you first arrived because you were overwhelmed by everything else. but you notice it now. The water that comes from the pump on the corner has a mineral quality, something that sits at the back of your throat, something grey and not quite clean. You boil everything. Everyone on this street boils everything. The cholera years were 30 years ago, but nobody has forgotten them. Not really. Not down here where people still live close enough to the river to smell it when the tide goes out. Mrs. Hennessy is already at the stove. This is not a surprise. Mrs. Hennessy is always already at the stove. You have worked for her for 13 months and you have never once been the first person in this kitchen. You suspect she does not sleep, not properly, that she does what old women who've been doing physical work their whole lives do, which is sit in the chair by the window and rest her eyes and call it sleeping, and that she's been at this stove since 3 or 4 in the morning because the fire has to be built, the coals laid, the first water put on, the fat started, and there are only so many hours in a morning and they all have to do something. She is a small woman, Mrs. Hennessy. She was probably larger once. Life has compressed her, not bent her, not broken her, just made her denser, the way wood compresses under weight into something harder than what it started as. Her hair is grey and pinned back so tight it pulls the skin of her forehead smooth, which gives her a look of permanent mild surprise. Her hands are the most remarkable thing about her. They are large for a woman her size, large and calloused and scored with 100 small white scars from a lifetime of working near heat and sharp edges. Those hands can reach into boiling water and remove something that needs removing without flinching. You asked her once how that was possible, and she looked at you with those mildly surprised eyes and said, "The skin goes eventually, and you stop feeling it the way you felt it before." She does not look up when you come in. She already knows you're here. "The bread's by the door," she says. "Start splitting." The bread. You find it on the shelf, by the door, where the cold from the street keeps it from going any further along the process it is already well along with. It is not one loaf. It is an assortment, a collection, a deliberate gathering of things that were once separately loaves. This is how Mrs. Hennessy gets her bread. She has an arrangement with the bakery on Whitechapel Road, the one run by the brothers whose last name you can never remember. Every 2 days she takes whatever they have left over from the day before. The pieces nobody bought, the loaves that went past the morning without selling, that went past the afternoon without selling, that sat in the window through the evening while the smell of fresh bread up the street pulled all the customers in the other direction. She buys them for a penny or 2 for the lot, depending on the quantity and on which brother she's dealing with, and she brings them back here and they become something else. You stand at the splitting shelf, which is a board balanced across 2 barrels at just the right height for you to work at without bending, and you work through the bread. Some of it can still be sliced. The loaves that are stale but not yet hard, that give slightly when you press them, that tear instead of snap. These you slice and set aside for the people who will come in the morning wanting bread and dripping, which is the cheapest thing on the board outside, 2d for a thick slice spread with the rendered fat you saw in the pot. The people who buy bread and dripping in the morning are going to work. Factory workers, mostly, dockers, men and women with early starts who don't have time to cook or a fire to cook on or anything in their room that constitutes a kitchen. Bread and dripping is their breakfast. It is the breakfast of roughly half of working-class London at any given moment. You have eaten it yourself more times than you can count. You understand bread and dripping, not as food exactly, as a transaction. You eat it because it has fat in it, and fat is energy, and energy is what you need to get through the next several hours. It doesn't taste of much. The dripping, depending on what it was rendered from and how long ago, can taste of beef or pork, or sometimes of nothing at all except salt and age. The bread beneath it soaks up the grease and goes from stale to damp, which is not an improvement in the way you'd hope, but which does make it possible to chew. It fills your stomach. That's the whole point. It fills your stomach. There are people in this story who will talk about food like it's a pleasure. You'll meet them later. The street vendors, the market men, the woman on the corner who sells eels and who genuinely seems to love what she does. But for most of the people who come through Mrs. Hennessy's door in the early hours of the morning, food is not about pleasure. It's about the next 4 hours. It's about not feeling the particular hollow ache that settles in behind your ribs when your body has been running on nothing since yesterday afternoon. The hollow ache is very specific, by the way. People who haven't been truly hungry describe hunger as just being in your stomach. But that's not right. Not after a while. When you're properly hungry, not just missing a meal, but running thin over days and weeks, the hunger is everywhere. It's in your hands, a shakiness you learn to ignore. It's behind your eyes, a brightness that isn't alertness, but something closer to its cousin. It's in your concentration, which starts to slide at the edges like ice melting, like... You can think about something clearly if you grab it, but the moment you let go it drifts away. You know the hollow ache well. You're working through the bread now. The bread that's too hard to slice, that snaps when you try to cut it. That would break a tooth if someone bit into it with conviction. This bread goes into the stock pot, eventually. But first you break it into pieces and put it in the soaking basin, cold water over everything, and you leave it there and come back to it later when it's gone from concrete to something that at least yields when you press it. The soaked bread gets used in the pottage, which is not a word anyone in this kitchen uses. Everyone in this kitchen calls it the pot stuff, or sometimes just the stuff. It has been called the stuff for as long as Mrs. Hennessy has had this kitchen, and probably for centuries before that, though nobody here is thinking about the centuries. You're thinking about the crack in your right boot sole and whether it's worse this morning than yesterday. It is worse. You can feel the cold coming through it as you stand on the stone floor near the door. You make a note to do something about it, and immediately forget the note because there is too much else to do. And because what would you do about it anyway? New boots cost 7 shillings at minimum, and you have 4 shillings and 3 pence to your name right now, of which 2 shillings need to go to rent at the end of the week, and the rest needs to go to food for 3 people for 7 days, which means you can do approximately nothing about the boot. You go back to the bread. Let's talk about what breakfast means in 1882 for a poor family in London's East End, because it doesn't mean what it means to you. Breakfast, for you right now, will happen somewhere between 6 and 7 in the morning, between getting the shop ready for opening and the first real rush of customers. It will consist of one of the following things, depending on the day. Tea. Not tea the way it's advertised on the tin with the lady in the beautiful garden and the roses. Tea the way it actually exists for people on your end of the economic spectrum, which is boiled water with a small amount of something brown stirred into it that is either very cheap tea or chicory, which is a root that has been roasted and ground and sold in place of coffee, because it's cheaper. Or sometimes it's both mixed together in a ratio that is meant to stretch the tea as far as it will go without becoming hot brown water, for which there is no polite name. You drink this with sugar if there is sugar, which there is on good weeks, or without sugar if there isn't, which there is on most weeks. You drink this from a mug that has seen better days. The mug has a crack in it that you have been expecting to become a break for the last 3 months. It has not broken yet. You are grateful for the mug. Bread. Whatever bread there is. If you're lucky, today's bread from the bakery, which would be a miracle on the wages you earn. More likely the bread from the Hennessy collection, the second-day bread that you sliced this morning, which is fine, which does the job. You eat it with dripping if there's dripping available, which there usually is in this kitchen, or with a thin scraping of something else if there isn't. The something else, when the dripping is spoken for, is treacle. Not golden syrup, the good kind. Black treacle. The dark, slightly bitter version that tastes of molasses and regret, and also, if you're hungry enough, of something vaguely sweet and acceptable, something your body can use. Black treacle on stale bread is not anyone's idea of a pleasant breakfast, but it has sugar in it, which is energy, and it coats the bread in a way that makes the staleness slightly less apparent. And when you've been working since 5 in the morning in a cold kitchen, and the first customers are already rattling the door latch, asking if the place is open yet, slightly less apparent is good enough. Sometimes there is nothing at all. You drink the tea and you work and you eat whatever comes when something comes. This is not a complaint. This is just how it is. Breakfast as a structured event. Breakfast as the most important meal of the day. Breakfast as something that happens at a table where everyone sits at the same time. That's for people with a different kind of life. For you and for most of the people on this street and for roughly 30% of the population of London at this particular point in history, breakfast is a cup of something hot and a piece of something bread adjacent consumed while doing something else, and then you get on with it. Mrs. Hennessy hands you the mug without looking at you. She's already drunk her own, probably an hour ago. There's a heel of bread on the board that she has clearly cut for you. Because it's cut at an angle she doesn't cut for the customers, the thicker angle she uses when she's being generous. You eat it standing up, mug in your left hand, bread in your right, looking at the pot and thinking about what needs to happen before the door opens. Watercress girl came early, Mrs. Hennessy says. Left a bundle by the side door. Is it fresh? Fresh enough. Fresh enough. This is the culinary standard of the establishment. Not fresh, not good, not excellent. Fresh enough, acceptable enough, edible enough. There is a whole philosophy encoded in that enough. It means this will do. It means we have survived worse than this. It means stop asking questions and get it into the pot. You finish the bread, you put down the mug, you go to the side door and find the watercress. Let me stop here and tell you something about watercress, because watercress is one of those things that sounds innocuous and turns out to be a whole story by itself. In 1882, watercress is one of the cheapest green things you can buy in London. A bunch costs a halfpenny or a penny depending on the seller and the day and how desperate you look. It comes in from the beds outside the city, mostly from Hertfordshire and Hampshire, where the clear chalk streams run fast enough to keep the beds clean, and it gets brought in on the early morning trains and sold on the streets by the watercress girls, who are mostly children or young women who are out in the cold before dawn to buy their stock from the wholesale market and walk their routes through the city, crying fresh watercress penny a bunch until their voices go raw. Some of these girls are very young, 8, 9, 10 years old. Henry Mayhew, who spent the 1840s and 1850s interviewing London's poor and writing it all down in a series of articles that became a book that everyone should read but almost nobody does, interviewed a watercress girl who was 8 years old. She told him she'd been doing the work for 2 years. She didn't go to school anymore. She carried bunches of watercress to Farringdon Market in the dark, and then sold them across the city, and came home in the afternoon, and slept, and did it again the next day. She was 8. She had been doing this for 2 years. The watercress itself, when it is good and fresh, has a peppery, bright taste that cuts through everything. It is one of the few truly nutritious things that the poor of Victorian London eat in any quantity, even if they eat it mostly because it is cheap, rather than because they are thinking about nutrition as a concept, which nobody in this kitchen is. Watercress has iron in it, has calcium, has vitamin C, though the word vitamin won't be coined for another 30 years, so what the people eating it know is only that it stops them getting the scurvy, the way sailors who eat citrus stop getting the scurvy, though none of them would use that exact formulation either. What they know is, watercress is good. Eat the watercress. The watercress is cheap. Eat it while you can. You bring in the bundle. It smells of cold water and green, a clean smell in this kitchen that otherwise does not contain much cleanliness. You sort through it quickly. Most of it is fine. The leaves are still dark, these stems snapping rather than bending. You set aside the 3 bunches that are starting to go yellow at the edges, the ones that are already on their way from food to something else, and you put them to the side for the stock pot. The rest goes in the bucket of cold water by the back wall where it will sit until it's needed. Mrs. Hennessy nods without looking. This is her highest expression of approval. The pot that Mrs. Hennessy has been building since before you woke up is enormous. Iron, dull black, hanging from a bracket over the main fire. It is roughly the size and shape of a large water butt, and it has been in this kitchen for longer than Mrs. Hennessy has owned the building. It came with the building. It may be older than the building. It has absorbed the flavours of 30 years of cooking and 20 years before that when a different cook used it for different purposes, and another decade before that when someone's grandmother used it for something you don't want to think about too hard. It is, in a way, the most important piece of equipment in this entire operation. What's in it right now? Water. Obviously water. Several gallons of it, because everything starts with water. Bones. This is where we should spend a moment, because bones are the backbone, if you'll forgive the word, of the poor Victorian diet in a way that people in the modern world find difficult to understand, because we live in a world where bones are an inconvenience, something to be picked around, something the dog gets. In 1882, bones are a commodity. They are bought and sold. There are bone merchants who go house to house buying old bones from households that have cooked a joint on Sunday and stripped it clean and think they're done with it. There are bone grubbers who walk the streets looking for bones that have been thrown away, which is something that happens rarely among the poor because the poor know what to do with bones. There are bone dealers near the markets who sell bones by weight to housewives and cook shops and anyone else who will buy. Bones make stock. Stock makes soup. Soup makes people less hungry for longer than almost any other thing you can prepare for the money it costs. A good stock, made properly from good bones, has collagen in it that breaks down during cooking into gelatin, which gives body and weight to the liquid, which makes your stomach think it has received something more substantial than flavoured water. A pot of bone broth, with a little barley and some onion, and a few scraps of vegetable is the thing that stands between a family and going to bed genuinely, badly hungry on a cold night. You cannot overstate the importance of stock. Mrs. Hennessy's bones today are 2 large beef leg bones, split lengthways so the marrow is exposed and will dissolve into the stock as it cooks. Several smaller bones that are harder to identify by this point in their journey. Some pork, probably. some veal perhaps, the kind of bones that come in a mixed assortment from the butcher when you ask for bones and he gives you what he has. 2 sheep's trotters that will cook until they fall apart and give their gelatin to the pot. The sheep's trotters are worth pausing on. In 1882, sheep's trotters are the feet of the sheep, cleaned and sold very cheaply, sometimes boiled and sold hot on the street from a can carried by a vendor, sometimes bought raw to cook at home, sometimes cooked down into broth. They are cheap because they are, in the hierarchy of meat, exactly as low as it is possible to go while still being a specific animal part with a specific name. Below trotters are scraps. Below scraps are the things that don't have names in polite conversation, but trotters are good. Trotters, cooked long and slow, give the stock a richness that the bones alone don't quite achieve. The skin and the connective tissue and the cartilage all break down and go into the water, and the water becomes something thick and glossy, something that clings to the spoon when you lift it out. Mrs. Hennessy knows this. She has always known this. Her mother knew it. Her grandmother knew it. This knowledge passed down through generations of women who did the cooking because someone had to, and there was never quite enough to cook with. And so you learned to make what you had into something better than what it was. Into the pot right now, alongside the bones, the onion skins you dried yesterday. Yellow and papery, they darken the stock and give it a colour that looks like it has more in it than it does. Celery tops, the bitter leafy ends that the market man gives you for nothing because nobody else wants them. A turnip that has seen better days, quartered and dropped in. The stale bread that has been soaking since this morning, which will cook down and thicken the liquid, the way bread has been thickening soup since long before anyone in this room was born. Later, when the bones have given up everything they're going to give, when the trotters have dissolved into the stock, when the whole thing has been cooking for 5 or 6 hours, Mrs. Hennessy will add barley. Pearl barley, in a quantity that is measured by weight and by budget, which right now is approximately 2 handfuls per pot, because 2 handfuls per pot across 40 or 50 servings is enough to give each bowl a slight thickness, a presence, a sense, that you've eaten something with more mass than just hot liquid. This is the soup. This is what will be served today, ladled into bowls for a penny each, to the dock workers and the factory girls and the sweated workers from the tenements, to the old man who comes every day and never speaks, to the woman with the 2 children who can afford the soup but not the bread, and sits them down and watches them eat it and doesn't eat herself, to the man with the badly set broken arm who's been coming in since summer and gets progressively thinner, to all of them, this soup, this pot, this 5 hours of heat and bone and onion skin and prayer. It is not a great soup. It does not pretend to be. If you tasted it with the part of your brain that has expectations, you would find it thin and slightly bitter from the vegetable scraps, and faintly metallic from the iron pot, and too starchy where the bread has thickened it unevenly. But if you tasted it with the part of your body that has been working in the cold for 4 hours on a breakfast of tea and a heel of bread, it is warm and filling and enough, always enough. That's the standard. That's all the standard needs to be. At 8 o'clock, Mrs. Hennessy gives you the basket and a list and 6pence. The list is in her head. She has never written a shopping list in her life. The list is whatever the 6pence will get, and specifically whatever the 6pence will get if you know how to shop, which means going to the right stalls at the right time and asking the right questions and knowing when something is priced for its actual worth. and when someone is trying to take advantage. You know how to shop. You've been doing this since you were 12, back in Shropshire, where the village market was small and everyone knew everyone, and the transactions were different, more personal, more forgiving. London's markets are nothing like that. London's markets are a combat sport. The market you're going to is 10 minutes walk, on a street that becomes a market 3 mornings a week, where vendors set up their stalls from 6 in the morning and start packing down from noon. You've been going there since your second week working for Mrs. Hennessy. You know most of the sellers by face, if not by name. You know which cart on the far left corner has the vegetables that have been sitting longest and will therefore be cheapest. You know that the fish woman in the middle, the one with the red scarf and the loud voice, keeps her best stock behind the display, and that you have to ask for it specifically. You know that the man who sells faggots and peas from the back of his cart will give you a better price if you arrive early, and even better if you tell him Mrs. Hennessy sent you, because Mrs. Hennessy is a known quantity on this street, a person who buys regularly and pays on time and doesn't try to return things. You put on your coat. It is the coat you arrived in from Shropshire, brown wool, and it has been mended twice in places, and the buttons are not the original buttons, but buttons from 3 different sources that match only in the approximate sense. You pick up the basket, you open the front door. London in October morning hits you all at once. Sound first, the street is already fully alive, the way these streets are always alive, without pause, without the quiet transitions you remember from the countryside, where morning arrived gradually. Birds first, then light, then sounds, building in some kind of order. Here there is no order. A cart horse is clattering on the cobblestones somewhere to the left. A woman is shouting from a window above you, not in distress, but in the particular Cockney register. That means she is conducting a normal conversation and simply does not feel the need to be quiet about it. Somewhere further along, a vendor's bell is ringing in a pattern that means nothing specific to you but clearly means something to someone. Cold air with coal in it. Always the coal. Always the faint dry smell of burning that sits over the entire city like a lid. Beneath it today, something fishy from the direction of the market, which means the fish delivery has already come in. Beneath that horse, always horse. In 1882, the streets of London contained thousands of horses, working horses, cart horses, cab horses, the delivery horses for the big commercial operations, and thousands of horses means thousands of pounds of manure per day. And despite the crossing, sweepers whose entire job is clearing path through it for pedestrians, the stuff is everywhere, in various stages of decomposition, contributing to the general character of the air. You stopped noticing it months ago. It is simply part of the atmosphere, like oxygen. You walk quickly. The boots squeak slightly on the left side where the leather has cracked. You keep close to the buildings on the right, the slightly higher ground, away from the gutter where the water and other things run. The market. You have to understand what a working-class market in 1882 is, because it is nothing like what the word market might call up in your head. Not quiet and organised, not a collection of nice stalls with craft goods and artisan cheese, not even really like the loud but pleasant farmers' markets you might be thinking of. It is chaos with economics inside it. The street is maybe 30 feet wide. There are stalls down both sides, which leaves perhaps 10 feet in the middle for people to walk, which means people are walking in both directions through a space roughly as wide as a very short hallway, while other people are stopping to buy things, and still other people are pushing through with handcarts or wheelbarrows, or just their own considerable physical mass, and everyone is talking or shouting or both. The noise is impossible. It rises above the general noise of the street the way a fire rises above the general warmth of a room. It becomes its own weather. The vendors are shouting their prices, which change from minute to minute based on what's selling and what isn't. Buyers are arguing prices, which is expected and even appreciated. The back and forth is part of the transaction. A negotiation conducted in loud voices as a form of theatre that both parties understand and neither party takes personally. Children are darting through legs. Dogs are doing dog things. Somewhere in the middle of all of this, a man with a barrel organ is playing something that may once have been a recognisable tune, but has been worn smooth by repetition into something more abstract. You navigate it the way you've learned to navigate it. Keep moving. Keep your basket in front of you. Keep your money inside your apron, not in the basket, because baskets can be dipped. Know where you're going before you leave home, so you don't stop to think in the middle of the flow, so you don't become an obstacle, so you don't give yourself away as someone who doesn't know exactly what they're doing, even if some mornings you don't. First stop, the vegetable cart on the far left corner. The man running it is called, by everyone, Old Charlie, though he is probably not as old as he appears. Work in markets in all weather ages a person rapidly. He has the kind of face that has been rained on so many times it has gone slightly past weather-beaten into something that is its own category, something that suggests the weather looked at his face and decided it had found a worthy adversary and gave up. He has enormous red hands that move through the produce with a certainty that suggests he's been doing this since before you were born. Morning, he says, without looking at you. He's arranging a display of cabbages with the focus of a sculptor. Morning, Charlie, what's on the turn? This is the question. Not what's fresh, not what's best, what's on the turn. Because what's on the turn is what's cheapest, and cheapest is what you're here for. He flicks his eyes to the left end of his display. You follow his gaze. A pile of carrots that have gone slightly limp, still orange but without their original conviction. Onions that are papery and starting to sprout. A bag of potatoes that have been sitting long enough to grow small white eyes on every surface, reaching for a light they aren't going to find. Carrots, penny for the lot. Onions, halfpenny each. Potatoes, threepence for the bag. You look at the potatoes. There are maybe 8 pounds in the bag. Threepence for 8 pounds of potatoes that are slightly past their best, but entirely eatable, is reasonable. Potatoes are the backbone of the poor Victorian diet in a way that nothing else quite matches. Not just in Ireland, though the Irish famines are still a living memory for people on this street, many of whom are Irish, or children of Irish who came over during the worst years. In England too, potatoes are the thing that makes the difference. A pot of potatoes boiled until soft, with salt if you have salt and without if you don't, with a scraping of dripping or lard on top if you're having a good week, is the evening meal for enormous numbers of families across the city. It is filling in a way that other cheap foods aren't. It has bulk. It has enough nutrition to keep you functional. It doesn't require much skill to cook, which matters because not everyone has a proper stove or the fuel to heat it, and boiling a pot of potatoes requires only a fire, which most people can manage. You buy the potatoes, you buy the carrots, you give the onions a pass because Mrs. Hennessy has onions already. Second stop, the woman with the red scarf. Her name, you have learned over 13 months of transactions is Bridget. She sells fish. Specifically, she sells the fish that doesn't sell at the grand fishmongers on the main streets, which means she sells the fish that arrived this morning on the train from the coast, and that is technically still fresh, and will be less so by this afternoon, and will be considerably less so by tomorrow. She knows this, and you know this, and the price reflects this knowledge. The fish she sells is cheap. In 1882, cheap fish is a crucial part of poor London's diet, and the most crucial of the cheap fish is the herring. Herring. Let's stay here for a moment. The herring is not glamorous. The herring does not appear in paintings of magnificent Victorian banquets. The herring does not feature in the menus of the famous restaurants in the Strand. But the herring, at this point in history, is quite possibly the most important single food source for working-class Britain. It comes in from the North Sea in quantities that would be hard to believe if you hadn't seen the markets at Billingsgate, where the fish arrives each morning in a cascade of silver and ice that fills the entire building. It is cheap because it is plentiful. It is nutritious because fish is nutritious. It is eaten in every possible way. Fresh and fried, salted and dried, smoked into kippers that last for days, pickled in barrels that last for weeks. A family that has herrings has protein, has fat, has something real to eat. Today, Bridget has herrings fresh off the morning's train, still firm and bright-eyed, smelling of cold salt water. She also has something else that she keeps in the bucket beside her stall, half hidden, priced lower still. Sprats. Tiny fish, small as your finger, caught in great nets along the Thames estuary and sold by the pound. So cheap it's almost not worth counting the money. Sprats are the poor man's food. Fried in a pan with a little fat and eaten bones and all, eaten fast before they go any further along the process they've already started, eaten standing up probably, 'cause sitting down takes time you don't have. You buy sprats today because they're 4p a pound, and Bridget is tired and you can see it in the lines around her eyes, and you know that a tired seller is a seller who wants to move stock. You buy them and you know what you're going to do with them. Third stop, the bread stall, not for today's bread, but for the broken biscuits. There is a vendor near the bottom of the market who sells, among other things, broken biscuits. These are exactly what they sound like. Biscuits, the factory-produced kind, the hard round kind that come in tins, that are shipped across the country in quantities that mean some of them inevitably break in transit. Broken biscuits cannot be sold as biscuits. They can be sold as broken biscuits at something like a quarter of the price, by weight, in paper bags, to anyone who will buy them. The people who buy them are primarily the working poor, who eat them as a snack or crumble them into tea or give them to children as something sweet in a life that doesn't have much sweetness in it. You buy a bag today. 3p, which is not nothing, but Tommy likes biscuits, and Tommy's cough has been worse this week, and there is a particular calculation that mothers make and sisters make, the same calculation, where you choose between the strictly practical and the thing that is not strictly practical, but that matters anyway. That matters because the person you love needs something that isn't just survival, needs something that tastes like more than just enough. You buy the biscuits, you look at your money, you've spent 4p on fish, a penny on carrots, 3p on potatoes, 3p on biscuits. That's 11p. You have a penny and a halfpenny left of the 6p, and you need to keep a halfpenny for the toll on the corner, the one you don't technically have to pay, but that the man on the corner has been collecting from everyone for long enough that it feels mandatory. 1 penny. There's a woman at the end of the market selling something from a bucket that you can smell from 3 stalls away. Peas pudding. Peas pudding is split peas, boiled until they collapse into a thick yellow paste, seasoned with salt and sometimes with a bone cooked in the water for flavour, pressed into a cloth and sold in rounds or pieces. It is ancient food that predates the Victorian era by centuries, food that was old when London was young. There's a nursery rhyme about it. Peas pudding hot, peas pudding cold, peas pudding in the pot 9 days old. People treat this like a quaint bit of folk memory. It is not a quaint bit of folk memory. The 9 days old part is not a joke. Peas pudding, bought from a street vendor on Monday, would be eaten again on Tuesday, on Wednesday, would be fried in a pan by Thursday, would be crumbled into broth by Friday, and the last of it, scraped from the bowl, would go into whatever was left in the pot on Saturday. 9 days was entirely possible. You buy a pennyworth. The woman scoops it out with a flat wooden paddle into a piece of old newspaper that she hands to you without ceremony. It's warm. It steams slightly in the cold morning air. It smells of nothing very specific, which is both its virtue and its limitation. Peas pudding smells like starch and salt, and it tastes like starch and salt, and its warmth on a cold morning is what you would describe as welcome, and what a Victorian food journalist, had such a thing existed in the form you might recognise, would describe as characterless. You hold it carefully, the newspaper warm through your gloves. You take a bite standing at the edge of the market because you still have that hollow ache from breakfast and the walk and the buying, and because Mrs. Hennessy will want you back and the walk is 10 minutes, and the peas pudding will be cold if you wait. It is warm. It is filling. It tastes like very little. It's enough. The market is starting to shift toward the end of the morning rush. The prices are subtly changing. You can feel it if you've been coming here long enough. The sellers who still have a lot left are starting to lower. The sellers who've had a good morning are starting to think about packing up. There's a particular quality to the noise at this point in the morning, a slightly lower pitch, a slightly less frantic energy. The way a river slows after a rapid and settles into something more sustainable. You pick up the basket and head back. On the way, you pass 3 things worth noting. The first, a woman sitting on the step of a building with 2 small children, a boy and a girl, maybe 5 and 3 years old. The woman has a piece of bread, a small piece, and she is tearing it into pieces and giving them to the children and not eating any herself. She is watching them eat with the focused attention of someone counting something precious. She doesn't look at you as you pass. The second, a costermonger pushing his barrow in the opposite direction, laden with cabbages. He's singing something, a popular song, the tune familiar though you can't name it. His voice is not good, but it is loud, and it doesn't care that it's not good. He catches your eye as you pass and grins. The third, a group of children, maybe 6 or 7 of them, ages ranging from perhaps 7 to 12, clustered around something on the ground in the space between 2 stalls that are in the process of packing up. They are not playing. They are eating. Something from the floor, literally, something that has fallen or been left or discarded. You don't stop to look more closely. You have learned not to look more closely at certain things on this street, but you know what it probably is. Dripping that has spilled from someone's cart, collecting in the gap between cobblestones, still edible if you're hungry enough, still providing fat and calories and whatever warmth fat provides, still better than nothing. The children are scooping it with their fingers and eating it. You walk faster. You're back by 8:30. The door is unlocked. The shop is open, technically, which means the board outside has been put out and the first customers are already inside. The cook shop is one room, roughly 12 feet by 15, 3 wooden tables with benches, a counter along the far wall where Mrs. Hennessy dispenses from the pot. The walls are painted a colour that may have been cream once, and is now the colour of the walls of a room that has had cooking fire, and many people inside it for a long time. There is a window to the street that hasn't been opened since August. There is a smell, the cooking smell you woke up to, but stronger now, more present, more layered, because the morning has added to it. The first customers of the day are already at the table near the door. A man and a woman, both in working clothes, the man with the particular heaviness of someone who works with his body and has been doing it long enough that it has become the default state of his body. He has hands like Mrs. Hennessy, large and calloused, scarred across the knuckles. He's eating bread and dripping and drinking something from a mug. The woman is eating the same. They are not talking. They eat with the focused efficiency of people for whom eating is a task to be accomplished before the next task begins. On the board outside, Mrs. Hennessy's prices: bread and dripping, 1 penny pea soup, 1 penny pea soup with bread, 1.5 pence boiled beef and vegetables, 2 pence faggots and peas, 2 pence cold boiled potatoes, 1/2 pence treacle pudding, when available, 1 pence. These prices represent, for most of the people who come in here, a significant portion of their daily food budget. The average unskilled labourer in this part of London in 1882 earns between 12 and 18 shillings a week, and from this he or she must pay rent, which for a single room of the kind most people on this street inhabit runs to 3 or 4 shillings, and coal and clothing and any other expenses of living. What remains for food is somewhere between 6 and 10 shillings for a week for a family, which works out to roughly 1 to 2 shillings a day, which works out to a few pennies per meal if you are feeding more than one person. A penny for soup is not cheap when you're operating in these margins. It is a luxury, just barely in reach of luxury, the kind of expenditure you justify because you need something hot, and you don't have a stove of your own or the coal to run it. The woman at the table near the window, the one who comes with 2 children on Tuesdays and Thursdays, is not here today. It's a Monday. She'll come later in the week when she has the pennies. Today, 2 small girls in factory aprons are eating the soup, eating it quickly the way you eat when your break is 15 minutes and the walk back to work is 5, which leaves exactly the right amount of time to eat and nothing over. You take your place behind the counter and you help with the ladling. The soup is thick now, thick with the barley Mrs. Hennessy added at 7, thick with the bread that dissolved into it overnight, thick with the fat from the bones and the gelatin from the trotters. It has a deep brown colour from the onion skins and the long cooking and the bones. It is not beautiful food. It is not the kind of food that gets described in terms that require more than a few words. It is hot. It is filling. It warms you from the inside out in the specific way that very little else can replicate when it is cold outside and you are cold inside and you've been working hard on not enough food. You ladle it. Bowl after bowl, for a few hours you ladle it and take pennies and half pennies and cut bread and arrange the bread and dripping and do the 100 small automatic movements of a job you have done enough times that your body does them without consultation. Your mind has the freedom to wander, which it does, mostly to Tommy's cough, and the broken boot and the 12 pence remaining in your apron pocket after the market and the rent that is due on Friday. But sometimes your mind wanders to the food itself, what it is made of, how it was made, where it came from. Let's step back from the cookshop for a moment. Let's talk about the broader picture, because the soup and the bread and dripping and the peas pudding are only part of it. If you want to understand what poor Victorian families actually ate, you need to go wider than one cookshop on one street. You need to understand the whole ecosystem of cheap food that existed in this city in 1882, the one that history mostly forgot because it wasn't glamorous and didn't leave records the way restaurant menus left records, didn't appear in cookbooks aimed at middle-class housewives who had servants and a proper kitchen range, and the leisure to think about food as something more than fuel. Start with the eels. If there is a single food that most completely represents the working-class London diet at this point in history, it might be the eel. Not the river eel, not the elegant thing that appears in fine restaurants. The eel pie and mash shop eel, which is a small, river-caught creature sold by the dozen from stalls and shops across the East End, cooked in two main ways: stewed in a liquor made of parsley and water, thickened with flour, served over mashed potato, or baked in a pie crust with the same liquor. The result is something that tastes primarily of parsley and salt and the particular mineral quality of the Thames estuary where these eels were caught. Eel pie and mash shops are on most major streets in the East End. They are cheap, they are filling, they are one of those foods that people who grew up eating them describe with an intensity of emotion that is partly about the food and mostly about everything the food meant. Being young, being in a particular place, the table where the family sat, the person who bought it for you. Food does that. Food carries memory in a way that objects don't. You've eaten eels twice since coming to London. The first time was strange, the texture unfamiliar, the taste different from anything you'd had in Shropshire. The second time was better. You've started to understand why people love them. There are also the penny dinners. In 1882, in various church halls and charitable establishments across the East End, penny dinners are provided several days a week. Not soup kitchens, which are a different thing we'll get to. Penny dinners. You pay a penny, you receive a cooked meal. The quality varies enormously. Some establishments run excellent penny dinners, proper portions of stew with vegetables or boiled beef with potatoes. Real food, good food, food that a person with dignity can eat without feeling they've compromised themselves by accepting it. Others are less good, the food thin and poorly cooked, the portions small, the table crowded, the whole atmosphere designed by the charitable impulse to help without quite believing that the people being helped deserve anything too comfortable. You haven't used the penny dinners, not yet. Mrs. Hennessy feeds you after a fashion the way the day's cooking feeds you. You eat what doesn't sell. You eat what's left at the end of the shift. You don't always eat well, but you eat. You're not at the penny dinner threshold yet. You're aware that the penny dinner threshold exists. You keep it in your peripheral vision the way you keep the pawn shop in your peripheral vision. Things you might need, things you hope you don't. Then there is the tripe shop. Tripe is the stomach lining of cattle, or sometimes sheep, cleaned and cooked and sold hot or cold from tripe shops and street stalls. It is one of those foods that people with options tend to avoid, but that people without options know how to cook well because necessity developed technique. Tripe and onions, properly made, tripe simmered in milk with onions until tender, seasoned with salt and white pepper, is warm and filling and considerably more complex in texture than you'd think. The texture, which is the main thing most people object to, is soft and yielding and slightly gelatinous, a quality that some palates love and others find challenging. The taste is mild, almost neutral, which means it takes on the flavour of whatever it's cooked with. In the parts of London where tripe shops operate, they are busy. A portion of tripe and onions costs twopence or threepence. It is a real meal for a real price. A meal that a working man can eat at lunchtime and return to work on. A meal that fills the stomach and provides protein and keeps the hollow ache away for several hours. The tripe shop on the corner of the street you pass on market morning smells, from the outside, primarily of the onions that are always cooking. It is a sweet smell, not unpleasant, the smell of something slow and patient. You have bought tripe there twice. It was good. It was not exciting. It was good. Let's talk about the cat's meat man. In 1882, in London streets, there's a vendor who walks a route every morning selling small pieces of cooked meat on skewers from a tray. He sells these as cat food. They cost a halfpenny or a penny per skewer. Cats are common in the city. Every household has them for the rats, and the cat's meat man's route covers perhaps 30 or 40 households where the cats are fed this cooked horse meat, or occasionally other meats of uncertain origin, every day. Here is the thing that the histories of Victorian food acknowledge carefully, and the popular version tends to gloss over. Not all of the cat's meat purchased from the cat's meat man went to cats. This is not malicious reporting. This is what the cat's meat men themselves said, in interviews, in surveys, in the records that social investigators like Charles Booth and Henry Mayhew compiled when they went around asking people how they lived. The cat's meat was cheap. It was protein. It was cooked. It was sold from a tray on a London street at a price that the absolute poorest could afford. And in a city where the absolute poorest included hundreds of thousands of people, including entire families of them, including children, including the sick and the elderly, and the recently arrived and the temporarily broken down, some portion of the cat's meat went to people. People ate it because they were hungry, not because they didn't know it was horse, not because they were deceived, because it was a halfpenny a skewer, and that was what was available, and the hollow ache is not abstract, and the children need to eat. This is the part of the Victorian poor's diet that doesn't get put on the nostalgic food history boards, the ones that celebrate Victorian street food as a forerunner of our food culture, the ones that feature illustrated prints of cheerful costers and merry market vendors and warm-lit stalls. All of that existed. It is not untrue, but it is not the whole picture. The whole picture has the cat's meat man in it. It has the woman scraping the fat from the butcher's bones after he's finished with them, bones he wasn't using and wouldn't sell, fat she's boiling down to make dripping that will last a week if she's careful. It has the children sent to the baker at closing time to ask for the stale bread that won't sell and would otherwise go into the bins, the bread given out as charity because the baker is not a bad man and doesn't want to waste it. The bread brought home and eaten immediately because there is no safe storage, and you eat what you have when you have it. It has the breakfast that is a glass of gin, because gin is cheaper than bread on certain mornings, which is its own kind of terrible, its own answer to a question nobody wanted to be asking. This is all real, all of it, the whole picture. By 11 in the morning the cook shop is at its busiest. The bench outside where you can smell the soup from the street has drawn a queue that goes 3 people deep, and in the room the 3 tables are all occupied, and the noise level has risen to the point where you have to half shout to be heard across the counter. This is the good part of the day. This is when the pennies come in, when the work feels purposeful, when the pot is doing what it was built for and Mrs. Hennessy is at her most focused and efficient, moving between the fire and the counter with the steady certainty of someone who has done this so many times, the movements are no longer conscious. You're on counter duty. You ladle soup. You cut bread. You take money. You make change. You do this in a rhythm, bowl bread penny change, and the people across the counter from you are a steady stream of different faces but similar expressions. The expression of someone who is tired and hungry and glad of something hot. The faces, though. If you pay attention to the faces, the docker who comes every day, big man with a jaw like a box and eyes that haven't had enough sleep for years. He takes his bowl and his bread and he sits at the far end of the bench and he eats with his elbows on the table and his head down. The posture of a man who has learned to eat fast in case something interrupts. He works at the docks when there's work. When there's no work, which is roughly half the days, because dock work in 1882 is casual labour, which means you show up at the dock gates at 6 in the morning, and if the foreman points at you, you work, and if he doesn't, you don't. On those days, he probably doesn't buy soup. The women from the match factory 2 streets over, 3 of them, who come in together and split a portion between them sometimes when wages haven't come yet. Splitting a bowl of soup 3 ways and eating it with the shared utensil because they've only got 2pence between them and a bowl. Costs a penny and 3pence total would solve the problem, but 2pence is what they have. The match factory women have, you've noticed, a particular smell that isn't quite right. Something chemical. Something that sits on top of the normal cooking and street smells and doesn't belong. You know what it is. Everyone knows what it is. Phosphorus. White phosphorus. Used in making the match heads, which gives off a faint luminescence in the dark, which the women sometimes joke about in the dark way that people joke about things that are going to kill them. Phossy jaw, phosphorus necrosis of the jaw. The women whose jawbones are being eaten away by their years of working with the chemical, who develop swellings and infections, and then the bone itself begins to decay, to glow in the dark with a horrible greenish light, to smell of corruption while they are still alive to experience it. Surgery sometimes helps, or helps a little, or delays, or doesn't help at all. It has been killing match workers since the 1840s. It is still killing them in 1882. The factory owners know this and continue to use white phosphorus because the alternative, red phosphorus, is more expensive by a fraction. The women come in 3 times a week when they have the money. They sit and eat and talk in low voices and laugh sometimes at things you can't hear across the room, and they look like what they are. Young women who are tired and hungry and who have friends and jokes and opinions and are not, in their own estimation, primarily victims. This is important. Remember it. The people who eat at Mrs. Hennessy's table are not primarily victims. They are people living lives, full lives, complicated lives, lives that contain laughter and friendship and opinion and dignity, and the whole ordinary machinery of human experience. They are also poor and hungry, and many of them are being slowly damaged by the conditions of their work and their housing in ways that will shorten their lives. Both things are true. They exist simultaneously, and the second one does not cancel the first. You think about this sometimes, between ladles. Not in those terms, not with that vocabulary. Just in the feeling of it. This sense that the people across the counter are more than the pennies they're putting down, more than the food they're eating, more than the circumstances that brought them here. Another, you ask a woman whose bowl is empty. She's been sitting there for a few minutes without moving, which usually means yes or no, but she hasn't decided. She looks up. Late 30s maybe, though she looks older. The way women in this part of the city often look older than they are. The weather and the work adding years to faces that started early and haven't let up. She has something in her eyes that isn't quite tired. Not resigned, something else. "Go on then," she says. She reaches into her apron and finds another penny. Slides it across the counter. You refill her bowl. She bends her head over it and eats and doesn't look up again. Tommy's at school. Or he should be at school. There is a board school on Raven Street that takes children for free, which has been the case since the Elementary Education Act of 1870 established that education should be universal and compulsory, which is one of the great Victorian accomplishments, and which, like many Victorian accomplishments, is considerably more complicated in practice than it sounds in principle. The practice is, children attend when their families can spare them. Families can spare children when the children are not needed for work, which is increasingly legally restricted but still happens, especially for the older children who can contribute meaningfully to family income. Families can spare children when the children have shoes, because the board school requires shoes, or at least strongly discourages the kind of barefoot attendance that was common in charity schools before. Families can spare children when attendance is not more urgently needed elsewhere. Tommy mostly goes to school. He's a good student, or at least he seems to be based on the things he comes home talking about. Arithmetic, geography, the expansion of the British Empire across territories you can barely picture. His teacher, he says, is a man named Mr. Falconer, who has a loud voice and a soft centre, which is his exact description. You find this description encouraging. But Tommy is also thin and has a cough, and on days when the cough is bad he doesn't go to school, and on days when your mother is particularly unwell and needs watching, he doesn't go to school, and on days when there is other work to do he might not go to school. Your mother, on those mornings, needs feeding. Here is what your mother eats, most days. Tea. The same tea, the same weak brownish water with the same minimal amount of the cheapest tea leaves available stirred into it. Your mother drinks this from the mug, sitting up in the bed where she spends most of her time now, because she is ill in the way that poor women in Victorian London get ill. Not from any one dramatic thing, but from the accumulation of all the small damages, the cold winters, the damp walls, the inadequate food, the grief for your father, the shock of the move, the stress of the money, the body that has been working since it was 12 years old and is now 53 and does not have much left to give. Bread. When there is bread, when there is slightly better bread, the kind that comes when you've managed to save a little extra, the kind with some texture still in it, she takes it gratefully and eats it slowly, which is the only way she eats anything now. Broth, when you can get it. When Mrs. Hennessy gives you the end of the day's pot in a jar to take upstairs, the thickened remnant, the sediment of the day's cooking. Your mother drinks it from the jar because there is only the one mug. She wraps both hands around the jar and holds it close. The warmth gets into her hands and up her arms, and you can see it happen in her face. Some small unclenching, some small easing of the discomfort that has become her permanent residence. Your mother was, in Shropshire, a good cook. She cooked on a proper range with proper fuel and a proper kitchen garden, and the things she made were real food, food with structure and intention, food that took time to prepare and rewarded the time. She made a rabbit stew that the whole village ate at the harvest gathering, or used to before things got harder. She made a sweat pudding with herbs that your father called the best thing in 3 counties, which was an exaggeration but not by much. She knew what she was doing. She does not cook now. She cannot. The illness takes energy and heat takes more energy, and she doesn't have what it would need. So you cook for her, and what you cook is simple, constrained by what you have and what you know, and the fact that the stove in this building is Mrs. Hennessy's stove, and using it outside of work hours is a negotiation you have to manage carefully. On good days, you make her a bowl of oatmeal. Porridge. Real porridge, the way it's made in the north of England and in Scotland. Oats boiled in water until thick, stirred until the grains are completely dissolved, salted, eaten warm. It is the most nutritious simple food you know how to make from cheap ingredients. Oats have fibre and protein and iron. Porridge stays with you in the way lighter things don't, gives you something to run on. Your mother says it reminds her of being a child, her own mother making it on winter mornings. She eats it carefully with a spoon, tasting each mouthful, and sometimes she makes a sound that is not quite a sound. Something between an exhale and something else. Something that you try not to hear too clearly, because the meaning of it is that she misses something you can't give back to her. Let me tell you about a specific meal. Not a meal at Mrs. Hennessy's, not a meal from the market, a meal that a family, a specific family, ate on a Tuesday in November of 1882 in a room 2 streets over from the cook shop, in a building whose top floor was inhabited by a man named Arthur, his wife Ellen, and their 4 children aged 9, 7, 5 and 18 months. Arthur worked in a tannery on the commercial road when there was work, which in November of 1882 was 3 days out of 5, the other 2 being days when the foreman told him not to come in, which was the casual labour system doing what it always did. His wages on working days were 2 and 6pence per day, which sounds reasonable until you understand that non-working days were not paid, which meant his actual weekly income fluctuated between 7 and 6 shillings and 12 and 6 on a good week. His rent was 4 shillings and 6pence for the room, which left between 3 shillings and 8 shillings per week for everything else. Food, coal, clothing, the baby's necessities, and all the small unplanned expenses of life that arrive without warning and cannot always be refused. Ellen managed the money. This was entirely her domain, not because Arthur was irresponsible with it, but because managing money under these conditions was a full-time skilled occupation, and Ellen had been doing it since she married at 20, and she was better at it than anyone else in the household, and everyone knew it. On Tuesday the 14th of November, Ellen had 6pence and 3 farthings to spend on food for 6 people for the day. She bought a pound of oatmeal, 2pence halfpenny, which would make breakfast porridge for the children, a 1/4 pound of dripping from the butcher who sold it by weight on Tuesday mornings when he had it, which he did this particular Tuesday, and which cost a penny. 3 pounds of bread from the day-old rack at the baker, which cost 2pence. A 1/2 pound of split peas from the dry goods stall, which cost a penny, which would go into a pot of peas pudding that would be part of dinner, and part of tomorrow's dinner, if she was careful with it. A few turnip tops, which cost her nothing because the market man gave them to her rather than throw them away. Total 7 3/4 pence, which was slightly over her budget, which meant she gave the market man the 6pence and 3 farthings, and he took the deficit out of the turnip tops and let it go, because this was not the first time and would not be the last, and he was not a hard man. She took everything home and she cooked. Breakfast was the oatmeal, made with water, no milk, salted and given to the 4 children first, and then she and Arthur ate what was left, which was not much, combined. The baby had some of the cooked oatmeal thinned with water, because the baby was not yet on solid food properly, but was hungry in the way babies are hungry, constantly and loudly, and the thinned porridge satisfied her in the same way it satisfied everyone, barely, temporarily enough. Midday, the children came home from school for dinner. Dinner, in Victorian working class usage, is the midday meal, not the evening meal. The evening meal is tea or supper. This distinction matters because it encodes the logic of the labouring day. You work all morning, you eat at midday. You work all afternoon, you eat something smaller in the evening. The substantial meal in the middle of the day is the one that carries you through the hardest working hours. Ellen's midday dinner for 6 people. Fried bread. The bread she'd bought that morning sliced thick and put in the pan in the dripping. Fried until the outside was crisp and brown and the inside was warm and soft. With the turnip tops boiled, soft and salted. Nothing else. That was dinner. Arthur came home for it, which he was able to do because the tannery was close enough. He ate 2 slices. The children ate 1 each. The baby was asleep. Ellen ate the heel of the bread, the piece that had been sitting in the pan and absorbed the last of the dripping, the piece with the most fat in it, the least appetizing looking piece. No one commented on any of this. Evening, the peas pudding, cooked through the afternoon, made from the split peas soaked in the cold water since morning, and then boiled for 2 hours on the small fire Ellen kept going with coals she rationed with precision. The pudding, pressed into a cloth and cooked in the pot, came out yellow and thick and fragrant with the particular slightly nutty smell of cooked dried peas. She served it with more bread, the last of the bread. Arthur had a larger portion. Ellen had the smallest. The children ate in the middle. This was a Tuesday in November in 1882. This was not a catastrophic day. This was a normal day. No one went to bed screaming with hunger. No one collapsed. The baby slept through. The children went to school in the morning and came home in the afternoon and did whatever children do in the evenings when there is nothing specific to do, which is exist in the particular, loud, unself-conscious way of children who haven't yet learned to be quiet about taking up space. But Arthur was 31 years old, and he was already tired in a way that 31-year-old men shouldn't be tired. His joints hurt in the cold. His back, which the tannery had been working on for 11 years, gave him pain that he didn't mention because mentioning it wouldn't change anything. Ellen was 28. She was thin in the way that women are thin when they eat last and least for years. Her hair had started going dull, which is a sign of nutritional deficiency, even if you don't have the vocabulary to describe it that way. Her hands were rough and calloused from work, and her teeth, which had been good teeth, were starting to give her trouble. Dental care in 1882 for people without money means you wait until the tooth becomes untenable, and then you go to the tooth puller and you pay the 6pence or shilling and you get through it. The children were thinner than they should be. The eldest, at 9, had the look of a child who had learned not to expect much and was philosophical about it. The 5-year-old had a brightness that survived everything, one of those children whose fundamental disposition toward the world is joy regardless of what the world gives back. And it was this child that Ellen looked at sometimes, with something complicated in her face. Something you could read as love or prayer or both. This was them. This was a family. This was what Tuesday looked like. Your shift ends at 2. You hang up the apron on the hook behind the counter. You take the basket, now empty except for the bag of broken biscuits you kept for Tommy. You go upstairs. Your mother is awake, sitting up in the bed, with the light from the grey window falling across her at a low angle, because it's November and the sun is never particularly high. She looks up when you come in. Her eyes have the quality they've been developing for months, a slight distance, as if she is looking at something just past you rather than at you directly. The fever comes and goes. Today she looks clearer than yesterday. "Sit down," she says. You sit on the edge of the bed, the springs pressing through the mattress into your hip. You take her hand, which is cold and slightly damp, the particular coldness of a body that isn't circulating heat quite as efficiently as it should. "Tommy's not back yet," she says. "He should be back by now." "He'll be at school," you say. "He's fine." "He had the cough again this morning." "I know." "You should." "I know." "You have had this conversation before. You should take him to the doctor." The doctor on Middlesex Street sees working people at reduced rates, 2 shillings for a consultation, which is not nothing but as within reach if you save up for it, which you have been theoretically saving up for, which keeps colliding with the rent and the food and the coal and the boot that needs fixing, and your mother's own ongoing requirements. You should take him to the doctor. You will take him to the doctor. You will take him to the doctor as soon as you have 2 shillings that aren't already spoken for. Your mother squeezes your hand once, lightly, and lets go. She's tired. She is always tired. You arrange the blanket around her and take the jar that was her morning tea down to the kitchen to refill it with whatever's left in Mrs. Hennessy's pot. Mrs. Hennessy, when you appear in the kitchen holding the jar, doesn't say anything. She ladles a portion of the day's soup into the jar and hands it back. This is not charity exactly, or it is, but it has been going on long enough that it has the character of a routine rather than an act of grace. You accept it without making the acceptance a performance. "Cold tonight," Mrs. Hennessy says. "Yes." "How's your mother?" "Same." She nods. This conversation has happened before too. Upstairs you sit with your mother while she drinks the soup from the jar. The light is changing. The afternoon is short now, in November. The dark coming at 4 and staying until 7 in the morning, which is 11 hours of darkness in a room lit by a single tallow candle that you try not to use until absolutely necessary, because candles cost money and darkness is free. You think about the faggots. There is a faggot seller, a proper one, who sets up on the corner of Commercial Street on Tuesday afternoons and stays there until he's sold out or until dark, whichever comes first. Faggots are a specific food, not the American meaning of the word, but the British one. Small balls or patties made from minced pork offal, specifically liver and heart and lungs, the cheapest parts of the animal, mixed with herbs and onion and fat and breadcrumbs, wrapped in caul fat, which is the lacy fatty membrane from around the pig's stomach, and baked or fried. They come from the tradition of making something from the parts that nobody else wants, the parts that get separated out during butchering and would otherwise go to waste or to the rendering vats. Faggots are cheap. 2 for a penny usually from the faggot sellers, 3 for a penny if the seller is feeling generous or if it's near closing time and he wants to clear his tray. They are rich in the way offal is rich, deeply savoury, fatty, with a flavour that is more complex than it has any right to be given what they're made of. They're usually served with peas, which is the pea gravy or peas pudding, and they eat well together, the richness of the faggot and the neutral starch of the peas, one serving the other. Tommy loves faggots. The broken biscuits are in your apron pocket. They're not much, but they're something sweet, and sweet is rare, and you put them on the upturned crate that serves as a nightstand, and you wait for Tommy. He comes in at 3:30, the door thudding open the way it always does when he pushes it too hard, the cold coming in around him before he manages to close it again. He's wearing his school jacket, which is a jacket, and his school trousers, which are trousers, and his boots, which have seen better days like all the boots on this street, and he has ink on his left hand from whatever they were writing today, and a red mark on his cheek from the cold outside, and his eyes are the same as they have always been, brown and bright and more present than the rest of him, looking at you with the particular quality of looking that means he wants to tell you something. "We learned about the Thames today," he says, pulling off the jacket. "Mr. Falconer showed us a map. The whole river from the source all the way to the sea. Did you? The source is in Gloucestershire." He says this with satisfaction, the way you say things you've just learned and want to hold for a moment. "In the Cotswold Hills. It's just a little stream there. Then it gets bigger. Here," you say, and you hand him the broken biscuits. He looks at the bag, then at you. He opens the bag and looks at the biscuits, the slightly crushed mixed assortment of institutional biscuit fragments, and he looks at you again, and you can see he knows what they cost and what they represent, and he has the good sense not to make it into a big thing. "Thanks," he says. He eats one, then gives you one, then eats another. Your mother, from the bed, watches this with the particular expression she's been developing, the one that is love and sadness, and something that isn't quite hope, but is adjacent to it. "I need to tell you about the night you went to the soup kitchen, not Mrs. Hennessy's cook shop, the charity soup kitchen, the one run by the mission in a former warehouse on Lehman Street, open on Thursday and Saturday evenings, providing free soup and bread to any person who came without requirement of prayer attendance or religious conversion, which distinguished it from many of the charity organizations in the area, which required you to sit through a sermon and some pointed observation about the state of your soul before you were permitted to eat. You didn't want to go. You'd been in London for 7 months when the week came, where the money ran out 3 days before the end of it. Not almost ran out. Ran out. The combination of rent and a doctor's visit for your mother and a pair of boots for Tommy, used boots, second or third hand probably, bought from a seller on Petticoat Lane for 6pence because his feet had grown again, and his old ones were causing blisters that had started to look wrong. These 3 things happened in the same week, and the result was that by Thursday morning you had nothing for food except the bread Mrs. Hennessy had already provided. Tommy needed to eat. You went. The queue outside the soup kitchen began forming at 5 in the evening, an hour before the kitchen opened. By the time you arrived at 5:30 with Tommy in tow, the line stretched half a block. You joined it without looking at the people around you. Tommy held your hand and you held his back. The line moved slowly. You could smell the soup from the street, coming out of a vent at the side of the building, a heavy vegetable smell, onion and turnip, and something roasted beneath it all. Your stomach, which had been running on tea and the remnants of Mrs. Hennessy's cooking since Tuesday, responded to this information in a way that was almost painful, a tightening and then a loosening, a physical plea. Tommy smelled it too. He looked up at you. He didn't say anything. A woman in front of you, in the line, had a baby on her hip, maybe 6 months old, wrapped in a shawl that was doing its best against the November air. The baby was quiet, not the good quiet of a sleeping baby, but the too quiet of a baby, that has used up its energy for protesting. The woman kept shifting her weight from foot to foot, a motion that was partly to keep warm and partly to keep the baby soothed, and partly the residual motion of someone who has been standing and moving all day and whose body doesn't quite know how to stop. She noticed you looking. "First time?" she said. "Yes." "They're all right here," she said. "They don't make you sit through nothing first. Just give you the soup and don't ask questions." The relief of that. The specific relief of being told you will not have to pay for food with your dignity, your privacy or religious affiliation, that you can simply stand in a line and eat. "My name's Mary," she said. "Agnes," you said. "This is my brother Tommy." Tommy said hello with the politeness he produced in the presence of strangers, the good manners that your mother had drilled into him in Shropshire, and that had somehow survived the 14 months in London intact. A small miracle. The door opened at 6. Warmth came out first, before the light, before the smell, just the warmth, physical and immediate, a wall of heat after 40 minutes in the cold. You went inside. The room was large, long tables running the length of it, wooden benches on both sides. The ceiling was high, the original warehouse ceiling, iron joists above. At the far end, 2 large cauldrons on a trestled platform, and behind them 4 women ladling. The soup was lentil. Red lentil which had cooked down into a thick orange-red mass, deeply flavoured with onion and something that might have been a stock bone and might have just been very long cooking. It was served in a deep bowl, big enough to be a meal, with a piece of bread cut thick. The bread was that day's bread. Real bread. Fresh, not the day-old kind. And this detail hit you somewhere you weren't expecting, because fresh bread is a smell that carries a particular emotional payload, the smell of enough, the smell of not worrying. And you stood there for a moment with the bowl in your hands and the warm bread in your other hand, and you were briefly and without warning back in your mother's kitchen in Shropshire on a Saturday, when the bread came out of the range and the whole kitchen smelled like the best version of itself. You sat down. Tommy sat beside you and began eating immediately, efficiently, with the focused appetite of a 12-year-old boy who's been at school all day and is hungry in the pure, uncomplicated way of 12-year-olds. He ate half his bowl and looked up and then looked at you and then looked at his bowl and finished it, and you could see him deciding whether to feel guilty about finishing it and deciding not to, which was the right decision. You ate more slowly. The soup was hot and slightly spiced. Something in it. Pepper, probably. Maybe something else. And the lentils had the earthiness that lentils have when cooked properly. A flavour that is not fancy, but is deeply satisfying in the specific way that proper protein is satisfying, the way your body responds to it by doing something that isn't quite relaxing, but is the nutritional equivalent of sitting down after a long walk. Around you, the room was filling. The long tables filling with people, all of them in various gradations of the same state. Cold from being outside, hungry from not eating enough, grateful in the specific restrained way of people who have learned that showing too much gratitude makes others uncomfortable, that it tips the transaction from charity into something that neither party wants to examine too closely. A man across the table from you was eating without looking up, his hat still on, his coat still on, which meant he had come from somewhere cold and was keeping the warmth inside himself as long as he could. An older woman at the end was eating with one hand and knitting with the other, a skill that implied she had done this enough times that the eating required no attention. 2 girls who couldn't have been older than 15, factory girls from the look of them, were eating and talking in low voices and laughing occasionally at something you couldn't hear. Mary sat down 2 seats away with her baby and ate one-handed while the baby finally slept against her shoulder with the relief of warmth. Nobody asked questions. Nobody gave a speech. Nobody made you sit through anything. The women with the ladles kept ladling. The bread kept coming in baskets from somewhere behind the cauldrons. The warmth stayed in the room. You ate your bread last, taking your time, pulling off small pieces and eating them slowly. The bread had a slight chewiness to it, a resistance that felt luxurious after weeks of day-old stale. You ate it all. When you were done, you sat for a few minutes in the warmth and you looked at Tommy, who was leaning slightly against your arm with the specific weight of a child who has eaten and is therefore approximately 10% less present than he was an hour ago. And you thought about Arthur and Ellen and their 4 children, about the faggot seller on Commercial Street, about the woman on the market steps who fed the bread to her children and didn't eat herself. You thought about the city above you, the city that had the grand hotel and the restaurant kitchens turning out 12-course dinners, and the men at their clubs eating roast beef and drinking port. You had never been near those places, but you knew they were there. Every person in this room knew they were there. The knowledge was not bitterness exactly. Not tonight. Tonight it was something more like clarity, an understanding of the shape of the world you were living in, the shape of it, the contours of it, the parts of it that bulged with abundance, and the parts that ran thin as paper. You were in the paper parts. You had always been in the paper parts. You would probably continue to be in the paper parts for a long time yet. But you were warm. Tommy was warm. The soup had been good. You got up and you thanked the woman who had refilled your bowl without being asked, and she nodded without making anything of it. And you took Tommy's hand and you went out into the cold November street and walked home. The art of Victorian poor cooking, the genuine art of it, was not the art of making things taste good from scratch. It was the art of extending, making things last, getting the most from the least, finding the nutrition in the parts of the animal or the vegetable that everyone else had given up on. Let's talk about dripping cakes. A dripping cake is made from the scraped down dripping at the bottom of the roasting pan, or the rendered fat from whatever cooking fat is available, mixed with flour and water and sugar if you have sugar, and dried fruit if you have dried fruit, and nothing at all else if you don't. It is baked in whatever the oven will do. It comes out dense and flat and darker on the edges than the middle. It tastes of the fat and the flour and whatever else went into it, and it keeps for several days if you wrap it and keep it cool. Dripping cake is not beautiful food. It is not the food of cookbooks, not even the economical cookbooks aimed at the working classes that charitable organisations started producing in the latter half of the century, the ones with recipes for nutritious cheap meals that assumed the reader had a range and fresh ingredients and a basic pantry. Dripping cake was below the level of those cookbooks. It existed in the oral tradition, in the knowledge passed from mother to daughter in kitchens that didn't have cookbooks, in the practical intelligence of women who had been feeding families on very little for their whole lives. You learned to make dripping cake from Mrs. Hennessy in your 3rd month of working there. She made it when the rendered fat needed using, and the end of the week needed stretching. She handed you a portion once without ceremony, and said eat. You ate. It tasted of warmth and fat and a faint sweetness from the dried currant she'd put in, and it was dense enough to sit in your stomach for hours. There was also the bread sauce. Bread sauce is not a sauce in the way you might think of sauce. It is not a light thing. It is old bread, stale bread, soaked in milk, and then cooked down on the fire with butter and onion and seasoning until it becomes a thick, heavy, pale mass that is essentially bread cooked into a different form of itself. It is a sauce in the same way that porridge is a sauce. It coats and fills and provides heat and carbohydrate and not much else. But what it provides completely. It is food designed not to be noticed while you eat it. Food whose virtue is its absence of quality, the way a blank wall is a virtue in a room where you want to see the furniture. Poor families made bread sauce from the bread they had no other use for. From the stale-through bread, the bread that had gone from soft to hard to beyond redemption, except for this, soaked overnight in whatever liquid was available, cooked down, eaten, nothing wasted. This was the principle, the fundamental organising principle of poor Victorian cooking, more important than technique or equipment or any particular ingredient, nothing wasted. The bones after the stock was made, dried and sold back to the bone man for a halfpenny. The vegetable pairings, into the stock pot, always. The fat that came off the top of any cooked liquid, skimmed and reserved, used for frying, used for spreading on bread, used for anything fat could be used for. The water that vegetables were boiled in, drunk or used for the next day's broth, because it had leached vitamins and minerals out of the vegetables as they cooked, and it was warm and it was free and it was, in a narrow technical sense, more nutritious than plain water. The tea leaves after the tea was made, dried and used again, and again, until the liquid they produced was so faint a brown it might as well have been water, and then you threw them away. The burnt bits at the bottom of the pot, scraped and mixed into the next batch, contributing their smoky bitterness to the general character of whatever you were making, the apple core into the pot, into the stock, giving sweetness to the broth, the chicken feet, long-simmered gelatinous, rich in the ways that the expensive cuts couldn't match, and always, always the fat, the dripping, the lard, the tallow, the rendered substance of animals that had been working and living and eating and dying in the British countryside and the British abattoirs and ending up, ultimately here, in the pot, on the bread, in the pan, keeping the people of the city warm and working and alive. Fat is not just calories. Fat is warmth. There is a reason that the body stores energy as fat, and the reason is that fat is the most efficient storage form, the most energy-dense molecule available to the organic world. A poor person in a cold climate eating a diet high in animal fat is doing something rational, not disgusting. The disgust came later, from people who had enough food to afford opinions about food. The poor didn't have that luxury. They ate the fat and were warmer for it. It rains on the Tuesday after the soup kitchen visit. Not the rain that starts in the morning and builds, the London rain that appears to have been there all along, as if the sky was always going to do this and you just didn't notice until now. It comes sideways off the Thames, carrying the river with it, cold and grey and slightly salty in a way that London rain sometimes is, close to the estuary, close to the sea. The cobblestones go dark and then slick. The gutters fill and the water finds the low places and the horses' hooves throw up arcs of it that are primarily water and primarily other things. By 9 in the morning the bottom inch of your boots is wet, the left one more than the right because of the crack, and you have been working for 4 hours already, and the crack will stay wet until the fire in Mrs. Hennessy's kitchen dries it from the inside out, which will happen sometime around midday if you stand near enough. Mrs. Hennessy's business is good in the rain. People who might otherwise eat their lunch standing up in a doorway or sitting on a step will, in rain like this, pay the extra halfpenny to sit inside at a table. The tables are full by 11:30. The smell of wet wool that develops in any enclosed space where wet people are gathered has been added to the normal register of smells. A warm animal smell, not unpleasant exactly. The smell of people drying out. A new face today, a man you haven't seen before, sitting alone at the end of the centre table. He is older, maybe 60, though again the difficulty of reading age on faces that have been worked. He is eating the soup with the methodical attention of someone who has not eaten recently and is being careful not to rush. The deliberate slowing down that prevents nausea when the stomach has been empty for too long. He holds the bread in his hand but doesn't eat it, as if he is saving it. He's not dressed like the factory workers or the dock labourers. He has the remnants of better clothes, a coat that was once good quality, visible under the general wear, a collar that was once white. The kind of dress that announces a fall from a better position, without specifying what that position was or why the fall happened. He looks up once, catches your eye, and looks back down at his soup. When he finishes the bowl, he carefully wraps the bread in a piece of paper he takes from his coat pocket, and puts it inside the coat, close to his body. For later, for tonight maybe, when there isn't a penny for another bowl. You refill his bowl without asking. He looks at you. There is something in his expression that is not quite what you expect, not gratitude exactly, something more complicated and more painful, the expression of a person who is not accustomed to receiving and has not found a way to be comfortable with the need to. "Thank you," he says very quietly. "Course," you say. He eats the second bowl too, still slowly, still carefully. He does not take the bread this time. He eats it there, at the table, in the warmth, which is perhaps enough. You don't know his story and you don't ask for it. Stories in this kitchen aren't required. You take the pennies when they're offered, and you ladle the soup, and you cut the bread, and the rain continues outside, and the room stays warm, and everyone in it, for this particular hour, is fed. There is a particular category of Victorian food that historians mention but don't dwell on too long. Food that existed in the gaps between the foods with names, the truly nameless things. The residue at the bottom of the fat jar, too mixed and contaminated with other things to be called dripping anymore but still edible, spread thin on a piece of bread and eaten at 6 in the morning before a 12-hour shift. The broth made from the water that potatoes were boiled in, salted and drunk from a mug, technically the ghost of a vegetable, not quite nothing. The crusts cut from better people's bread and sold at the back door of certain establishments for a halfpenny per pound, bought by women who came early and knew the system, who took them home and made them into something. The slightly rancid butter, sold cheap from the back of carts near the docks, still edible if you cooked with it rather than ate it cold, still providing the fat and calories that were the point of butter even when the flavour had gone somewhere unpleasant. The second-hand tea. You think that's a made-up thing. It is not. There were, in the 1880s, sellers who collected used tea leaves from the hotels and the better houses, dried them, and resold them to people who could not afford proper tea. You were drinking something called tea that had already been tea once and was now making a second attempt. The pig's head, a boiled pig's head, which the butcher sold very cheaply because it was unsettling to look at and most people didn't want it on display, but which provided an enormous amount of meat if you knew where to find it. The cheeks, which were thick and yielding and surprisingly delicious, slow-cooked with herbs. the tongue, which was a proper piece of muscle that sliced and served cold, the ear, which was cartilage and skin, but which, fried crisp, had a texture and richness that people who grew up eating it remember with an affection that surprises them. A pig's head, cooked properly, could feed a family for 2 days, nothing wasted, and the fish tails, the parts left after the fishmonger filleted the good fish, which cost almost nothing, and went into a pot with onion and potato, and came out as something that wasn't quite fish soup and wasn't quite stew, but that had body and flavour, and the particular warmth of cooked fish in cold weather. And the bread pudding, not the fancy version, the version that was old bread soaked in the leftover liquid from whatever you'd cooked yesterday. The bread that absorbed the flavour of the previous meal, pressed into a baking dish or cooked in a pot, eaten warm or cold, sweet or savoury depending on what you had, eaten because the bread existed and bread should not be thrown away. All of this existed. All of it was eaten with real hunger, and sometimes with real pleasure. Because hunger is a source, as they say, though the people on this street didn't say it that way, they just knew it to be true. Food you need tastes better than food you merely want. The animal fat on the stale bread, when you've been working since 5 in a cold kitchen, has a richness to it that the breakfast pastry in a warm house can't replicate. The pea soup after 4 hours in the rain has a warmth in it that goes further than temperature. This is not to romanticize poverty. Poverty is not romantic. It kills people. It killed Arthur and Ellen's children at higher rates than children in better houses. It killed mothers in childbirth because poor women were worn down before they got to the delivery and because the conditions of poverty don't leave reserves for crises. It killed men in their 40s, whose bodies were used up and whose rest was never adequate and whose food was never quite enough. Poverty is not romantic. But the food made in those conditions by those women from those ingredients, there was something real in it, something that came from necessity but became technique, became knowledge, became the inheritance that passed from mother to daughter in kitchens that barely counted as kitchens, in rooms that barely counted as rooms, in the cold and the dark and the always insufficient, women making something from almost nothing, every day, forever. That is a different kind of knowledge, a different kind of mastery. It should not be forgotten. It is December now. The cold has become a permanent condition. The market is harder in December. The vendors stamp their feet, and their breath comes out in clouds, and the produce freezes at the edges of the stalls on the coldest mornings, the outer leaves of the cabbages going stiff, the carrots brittle enough to snap if you grip them wrong. You wear both pairs of stockings. You wrap your hands in rags under your gloves because your fingers cramp in the cold and you need the use of your hands. Tommy's cough is better. You took him to the doctor on Middlesex Street on a Wednesday 3 weeks ago. The 2 shillings finally accumulated, the appointment made. The doctor was a brisk, not unkind man who examined Tommy with the efficient confidence of someone who sees 20 children a week, with the same combination of symptoms and has a clear idea of what to do. He gave you a prescription for a syrup. The syrup cost 6pence at the chemist, which you bought. The syrup smells of menthol and something else, something chemical. Tommy takes it each evening with the expression of someone making a sacrifice on behalf of the household. The cough is better. Your mother is also better, or not worse, which at this point is the same thing. She sits up now, some mornings, in the chair by the window, looking at the grey sky and the backs of the buildings across the way, with an expression that might be contentment, or might just be exhaustion mistaken for peace. Either way, she is present. She is there. She asked you last week to tell her about the cook shop. She'd never asked before, had let you report the practical facts of your work without asking for the texture of it. You sat with her for an hour in the afternoon after your shift and you told her about Mrs. Hennessy and the soup and the bread and dripping and the woman who feeds the children first. About the match factory girls and the smell of phosphorus on them. About the old man who took the bread away wrapped in paper. Your mother listened. She had her eyes half closed the way she does now, listening. When you finished, she was quiet for a moment. "It was like that in the bad winters when I was small," she said eventually. "My mother made a broth from what she had. She called it nothing soup because it was mostly nothing, but it was hot." You thought about that. Nothing soup. "Was it good?" you asked. She opened her eyes. She looked at you with something that was close to amusement. "It was hot," she said again. "When you're cold and you're 7 years old and you've been outside all day, hot is good." Christmas in the East End of 1882. You need to know this. Even if it surprises you, Christmas among the poor of Victorian London is not the bleak nothing that you might imagine. It is not the non-event that pure poverty logic would suggest. It is in fact an occasion. The occasion. The point in the year when extra effort is made. When small amounts of extra money are put aside over the weeks before. When the luxury budget, such as it is stretched to its absolute limit and beyond. This matters because it tells you something about the people in this story that is worth knowing. They were not purely rational economic actors, maximizing caloric intake for minimum expense. They were people. They had traditions and attachments, and the specific human need to have some things be different from the ordinary, to have one day be the day when the food is more than just enough. In the weeks before Christmas, the markets fill with things that aren't normally there. Goose clubs run in the factories and workshops, which are informal saving schemes. You put in a penny or 2p a week from October, and at Christmas you get a goose, or the money to buy one, or a portion of a goose, or the elements of a Christmas pudding, depending on the club and the week and how many members there were, and whether the treasurer was honest. Goose clubs were one of the main ways the poor of Victorian London ate roast meat on Christmas Day. The goose was not the small, elegant bird of the cookbooks. It was often a large bird, tougher than it might have been, older than ideal, sold at a price that reflected its age, and the fact that it was being purchased on Christmas Eve by people who did not have the luxury of being particular. It was cooked in whatever configuration the cook had available to her. In a range if she had a range, in a communal oven if the baker was running a Christmas Day service as some did, at Mrs. Hennessy's if Mrs. Hennessy was in a generous mood. Mrs. Hennessy, as it turned out, was in a generous mood. On Christmas Day 1882 she let the use of her oven to 6 households on the street, one at a time for the goose cooking. They brought their birds in the morning, wrapped in whatever wrapping was available, and she cooked them through the day, and they came back at midday to collect them, and she charged them nothing and said nothing about it, which was just how she did things. You had no goose. The goose club at the matchstick factory where you were no longer working had closed before Christmas, because the woman running it had moved away, and the money had not all been accounted for in the transition, which was a way of saying some of it was gone. You had stayed in the club through October and November, and the money was not coming back. But you had this. Tommy had, through some combination of odd jobs and the specific resourcefulness of a 12-year-old who has learned to notice opportunity, accumulated 4p. He gave it to you without preamble on Christmas Eve morning, and said he wanted to get something for Christmas dinner. With 4p, you bought a piece of salt pork belly from the butcher, the cheapest cut, fat layered with thin veins of meat, which would be boiled for a long time with whatever vegetables you could add. You bought turnips, a penny for 3, from the market man who was selling down fast because it was Christmas Eve and nobody wanted to cart produce home overnight. You bought the heels of bread from Mrs. Hennessy's board for a halfpenny. You went home. You made the pot. The salt pork went in first, in the big pot borrowed from Mrs. Hennessy, covered with water, brought to a boil and then reduced to a gentle simmer. The turnips went in an hour later, cut into pieces, their bitterness cooking out into the water, contributing their substance to the pot. The bread heels went in last, soaking and thickening, doing what bread always does in a pot, becoming part of the liquid, giving it body and weight. You cooked it for 3 hours. Your mother, who had come downstairs for the first time in weeks, sat in the chair that was brought down for her and watched you cook. She didn't say anything for a long time, just watched. The fire in Mrs. Hennessy's kitchen throwing orange light across the room, the steam from the pot making the air warm and slightly damp, the smell of the salt pork and turnip filling everything. Tommy came in at 1 o'clock cold from outside with snow on his jacket because it had started to snow. Proper snow, the first significant snow of the winter. He shook himself like a dog and stood near the fire, and the cold came off him in a wave that was quickly absorbed by the kitchen warmth. "Is it ready?" he asked. "Nearly," you said. You tasted the broth. It had the deep, salty richness of the pork, the slightly sulphurous sweetness of the turnips, the starchy thickness of the bread, all of it working together, none of it brilliant, all of it satisfying in the specific way that long cooking always is, the way that patience in a pot rewards itself. You ladle the bowls. For your mother, a deep bowl with a good piece of the pork and plenty of the turnip cut small for her, because her teeth are not what they were. For Tommy, a large bowl because he is 12 and it is Christmas and he has earned it. For yourself, bowl full enough, but with the reasoning that there might be seconds and you should leave room for seconds. You sit at the table, all 3 of you at the table in the warmth. Outside, London was doing what London does, which is continue. The streets were quieter than usual, the snow muffling the sounds, but not silent, never silent. Somewhere a church bell was ringing. Somewhere a cart horse was moving. The city did not stop, but in this room, for this hour, you were still. Your mother looked at her bowl. She picked up the spoon. She ate slowly with concentration, the same concentration she brought to the porridge in the mornings and to the soup from the jar, and to everything that she ate, as if each mouthful deserved attention. "Good," she said. Not effusive, not dramatic, just good. It was enough. Tommy ate his bowl in what seemed like a single continuous motion. He looked up at you with the expression of someone who has eaten well, and is at peace with the world, and is perhaps thinking about the snow outside, and whether it will be enough for what 12-year-olds do with snow. "Can I have seconds?" he asked. "Yes," you said. You gave him the bowl. You gave your mother more of the broth. You finished your own. The snow came down outside, steady and soft. The fire in Mrs. Hennessy's grate burned through the afternoon. Your mother dozed in the chair, and Tommy went outside for the snow and came back an hour later frozen and happy. And you made tea, the weak tea, the always tea, the cup that was always available and always warm and always the same. You drank it standing at the window looking out at the street. The city covered in white for one quiet hour looked like something else, like something that had been given a temporary rest, a reprieve from its own noise and grime and relentless appetite, like something that had been cleaned by the snow and was being given a moment to be what it looked like before everything started again. It would start again tomorrow, the market would open, the cook shop would open, the factory girls would walk to work in the slush, and the bones would go back in the pot, and the watercress girl would arrive at the side door before 5 in the morning, and everything would be exactly as it had been. But right now, tonight, the snow was still falling. The tea was warm. Your mother was asleep in the chair. Your brother was upstairs, probably asleep too, warm and fed, his boots drying on the grate. You were here. That was enough. Later, much later, when the candle had been blown out and the fire was banked low and the room upstairs had reached the particular cold that settles after midnight in November, you lay down in the dark. Tommy was already breathing in the even rhythm of sleep, his body taking what it needed without ceremony. Your mother's breath came slower, deeper, the breath of something close to peace. The sounds of the city came up through the walls. They always did. They always would. Somewhere out there, someone was working, someone was drunk, someone was hungry, someone was making a pot of tea, somewhere in the dark, standing at a window, looking at the snow. This city, this terrible, magnificent, exhausting, relentless city, it ate people. It did. You had seen it happen. The matchstick girls and their slow chemical death. The men at the docks waiting every morning to be noticed, and not always being noticed. The old man with the bread in his coat pocket. The woman on the market steps feeding her children and eating nothing herself. The city ate people and kept going. But the people kept going too. That was the thing. That was the thing you hadn't known before you came here, that you had to learn by living it. The people kept going. They made the soup from the bones, and the bones from the cheap cuts, and the cheap cuts from what was left. And they made bread pudding from old bread, and peas pudding from dried peas. And they made something from nothing, over and over and over, every day, in kitchens that barely counted as kitchens, in rooms that barely counted as rooms. They fed each other. Not the grand charity, not the institutional charity, though those existed. Just the, here, take this, it's enough, we can spare it. Mrs. Hennessy's extra ladle into the jar. Mary in the soup kitchen queue telling you it's all right in here, they don't make you sit through anything. The market man who gave the turnip tops for nothing and called it square. The baker with the day-old bread. He kept separate from the bins. The city ate people, but the people fed each other. You thought about this in the dark. You thought about your mother's hands when she ate the Christmas broth, both of them wrapped around the bowl, taking the warmth in. You thought about Tommy's face over the broken biscuits, giving you one before he had any himself. Small things. Small, ordinary, unremarkable things. Everything. The years ahead of you are full of things you can't see from here. They will be harder sometimes and easier sometimes, and they will be your life, the only one you get, and you will live it in this city that is loud and cold and vast and smells of coal and horses and the river and the food from 100,000 kitchens at once, each one making what they have into what they need. You will learn more. You will learn that the watercress girl's name is Jane, and she is 9 years old, and she is saving to buy her mother a new shawl for winter, and she has a sister at home and a cat named something you can never quite catch when she says it, something that sounds like copper. You will learn that the match factory girls start a union, that they go on strike, that they win. that this will matter to more people than will ever know their names. You will learn that Mrs. Hennessy has a sister in Cork and sends her 2 shillings every month without fail, has been doing it for 20 years, will keep doing it until she can't. You will learn that Tommy grows out of the cough, that he stays in school, that Mr. Falconer notices him and gives him books to borrow, that he reads everyone. You will learn these things and more things, and the city will keep going around you, and you will keep going inside it. But tonight, none of that has happened yet. Tonight is just tonight. The dark is soft. The sounds of the city are going quieter, not silent but lower. The city settling into the register it uses for the small hours, the register of watchmen and night shift workers, and the last of the tavern noise drifting across rooftops. Your bones have been working since 5 in the morning. Your feet ache pleasantly from the standing. Your hands, which have been in water and near heat, and working without rest for 10 hours, have a warmth in them that is the warmth of bodies that have used themselves well. You did what you came to do today. You fed people. And now you are warm enough, fed enough, safe enough. You have a roof and a blanket and the breathing of your brother beside you and your mother asleep in the next room and the city outside still moving, still alive. That's enough. That's always been enough. The sounds are fading now. Or maybe it's you that's fading. The voices from the street going soft. The cartwheels on cobblestones going softer. The distant bell of a church marking an hour you're too far into sleep to count. Let it go. Let the day go. Let the cold outside stay outside. Let the warmth you found stay with you. Let your breath slow. The way your mother's breath slows, the way your brother's breath slows. The deep rhythm of bodies that have earned the rest, that have given the day what the day asked for and are now taking back what the night offers. The soup will be started tomorrow before the light. The bread will be sliced. The watercress will come before 5. The boots will be worn again, and the cold will be cold again, and the pennies will need to be counted again, and all of it will start again. But that's tomorrow. Right now there is only this, the soft dark of the attic room, the sound of London at rest, or almost at rest, breathing in and breathing out through 1,000 chimney stacks, alive in the way cities are alive, never completely still. You were here, you were fed, you were warm, you mattered to 2 people sleeping in the rooms around you, and they mattered to you, and in the complicated arithmetic of what a life is worth, that is not nothing. That is not nothing. That's everything. Good night.